Ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Dar, good evening. It is our pleasure to open this night with a fascinating lecture by Miss Alison Shan Price, titled Consuls, Crinolines and Camels. Tonight, Miss Price will guide us through the stories of extraordinary women who, in the 19th century, defied social norms to live, travel, and learn across the Arab world, from Syria to Yemen and beyond. Alison Shan Price is a cultural historian and a dramaturg, and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society for over 4 decades in Kuwait. She has collaborated with regional scholars to present Middle Eastern history through lectures and performance. Her work on independent Western women in the Middle East has been featured at al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, the British Academy, and the University of Oxford. Please join me in welcoming Miss Alison Shan Price.
Sheikh Hussa, al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, the National Council for Culture, Arts and Letters. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to return to Kuwait, my home for 40 years, to give this lecture tonight. It's part of my academic research, which at the moment has a working title of Mapping the Political Space of British Women Arabists, 1815 to 1945. But don't worry, I'm not going to tell you all about that today, because it's incredibly large if you look at all the research material that's gone into it. I wouldn't have been able to do this without you. I come to you, certainly tonight, to tell me that if you have any links, any information whatsoever, please let me know. And if you'd be willing to give an interview too, as an oral history, an oral archival research interview, it would be my pleasure to meet you. Because I do not want to just give my viewpoint or the ladies' viewpoint, I want to give your viewpoint forward. And that is part of building bridges that I'm working towards in Britain at the moment. I would like to acknowledge all the people that have helped me so far. If I have not got your name on the list, please forgive me, and please remind me exactly what the spelling is, and to make sure that I'll put that on there. So I'll give you a little moment to look at how many people so far have contributed to the research that I'm actually doing. I've learned a lot, and I hope that people in the West certainly will learn more. I think you recognize Sir Richard Burton here, those of you who know about history. But this is a consul. His role was to secure trade and also make stable the trade routes that went through where Britain's trade was working. He had to balance the demands of multicultural networks because he worked with so many different nationals. He had to monitor the movement of the fellow subjects. Now, this was a problem because he could also discipline them if necessary. And until 1825, he worked under 2 masters. One was his sovereign and the consul general, or the ambassador, and the other, which you might be quite interested to know, was also the directors of the trading company that paid his salaries. His salary, the buildings, the gifts, the table, and all the people that he had to pay had to come from somewhere, and it's incredibly costly. He had to make sure there was no international incident. Second part is, this is the crinoline. If you notice, it's a cage, and it's actually called the cage crinoline. It's a steel contraption. It actually goes over the corset, which is made of whalebone, and that aim of the corset is to halve the size of the waist. And women voluntarily climbed into it and locked themselves in. It stops mobility, and it also stops voice. This is a camel. Women included in our lecture, having thrown off the whalebone, the steel, and the consul, rode into the desert sunset to learn about the Middle East. Now, they were prepared. It wasn't random. They made sure that they could speak languages, and they were fluent in Ottoman Turkish, Fusha, Arabic dialects, and they were honed through Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, the Gulf, and the Arabian Peninsula. And this was before World War I, when our map changes. More women that I do, they will go through World War I, and then they go through the New World Order, and of course our map would change for different countries. And they go through to World War II. Now, from the opening in 1830 of the Royal Geographical Society, although women were not allowed to be fellows until 1913, it took that long, they were trained in cartography and surveillance. And I'm going to show you a map. Apologies, I think we've just jumped over it, yes. This one is Gertrude Bell's map, and I am very grateful to the Royal Geographical Society for allowing me to show you this tonight. It might not be her actual map, because they actually had people that could put all the maps together, everything that they got through. And they stated that we will train you if you give us the map. What they didn't tell anybody was that if the map belonged to them at time of war, the war would make sure that that map would go to the War Office. So sometimes when you're reading, it says certain maps were with the Royal Geographical Society and the War Office. Women would not send it directly to the War Office because, of course, women were subaltern, and it wasn't accepted that they knew anything at all at that time. So it would go straight through to the War Office from the RGS, and the RGS, when I went there recently, told me that information. Now, danger was ever present. Severe sandstorms, floods that destroyed towns, hurricanes on the Euphrates, capsizing steamboats, lions, hyenas, wolves, ostriches, horses, earthquakes, raids, droughts, sandfly fever, malaria, cholera, dysentery, measles, and the plague. What was amazing about these women was they counteracted all of this, and they loved it. They kept coming back time and time again. And the ladies I talk about today, they lived to the end of their lives and are buried in the Middle East as well. Now, I've shown you here, and this is from the Royal Geographical Society, and you can actually buy this online, a wonderful little book called Hints for Travellers and Hints for Ladies Travellers. It's very different to the Hints for Travellers by the Royal Geographical Society, which I used during a workshop playing Gertrude Bell to train up school children about building bridges and taught them a little bit of Arabic, etc. That one's incredibly complicated, but not for many of us who've actually done logarithms and trigonometry, because Gertrude Bell would have to, number one, check her watch by the sun. Number two, she would have to look for something that would give her a triangle to be able to take measurements and say, okay, I know where I am now. But in the desert, it was impossible. So what she did was she would actually plot by the stars. And because I went into that book and saw her maps of stars and saw her circles and Saturn, Venus, and all sorts of planets, etc., I was able to realize that she mapped by night. And she had to move by day. So she had to travel in the winter. And all these little pieces of information enable me to know quite a few things that go through. So it's in the winter, of course this would happen. Of course that would happen. And what happened with the Hints for Lady Travellers is slightly different. Now, Lillian is tremendously erudite and she's travelled a lot. And she would tell ladies about the furniture cases, clothes, and a dampness, and a wonderful thing, I could go on forever, but I won't because I've got a lot to do. How to tell if your sheets are damp. You would put a hand mirror in between the sheets, and if it steamed up, it was damp, and that could kill you. So you make sure that you only have dry sheets, take the sheets off, get in your blankets, roll yourself up. It might be uncomfortable, but you should wear almost like a baby's romper suit, and they designed it. Much money was made for women's travels because women threw off their crinolines, had little bags, and they would carry everything with them, including a St. John's ambulance kit, because often they had to perform operations within the desert. She tells us about shipwreck, and she says, if you're going to have an imminent shipwreck, you must have a board, look around for wood, and also around your waist, tie food, because food would be so much more important than your jewels. She tells us that for trains, that if you hear that your train is going to crash, obviously it happened quite often. If the train is going to crash, lift your legs up and put them on the other side of the bench, because when your train concertina's in, the benches come together and there's no way they can free your legs after that. So what I love most of all is that what she says is, being a member of the weaker sex, if there's a man who says he can do something, step back and allow him to do it. But be prepared to jump in at the last minute. Also, with this statement, pack a very warm pair of socks. Moving on, I'm just trying to move here. But General Allenby would have disagreed. He was asked to write the foreword for Rosita Forbes, and he stated, I'm honoured that I should be asked to write this foreword, which deals with exploration achieved in her 1,100-mile mule journey from the Red Sea to the Blue Nile. She's an intrepid English woman, and she leads us through experiences that would have appalled the hardiest of old-time pioneers. So men were backing women at that time, and they were reading about it, and they were telling everybody about it. So I'm really surprised today that nobody knows about these women, because wouldn't it be wonderful if they did, and they would give inspiration to girls. Now, what we have here might interest you very much indeed, is that I'm going to start with the relationship between Britain and the Middle East. I went backwards, and I'd always been told, never start your history from a point where you have to go backwards, because you get a very wrong impression of what it is about. Never start your history in the middle, and you will get a wrong impression, because it's very easy, isn't it, to take a line out of something or someone's letter and write a whole PhD on it. And then you find out your bias would follow through. So I went back and back and back, and I was fascinated to find that Britain and the Middle East had a 3,000-year-old relationship. And I'm very grateful to my docent training by Sue Day, where she said, and she would say, that's the beginning of recorded history. It might have happened much earlier. Now, this was in the Bronze Age, and you'll find this in the Royal Exchange in London, and it's 5 meters by 3 meters. It's a fresco on the wall, and it shows that there was trade between Britain and Phoenicia, of the Phoenician states, and they shared resources. They also shared cultural interaction, and we don't know whether or not Britain was colonized by the Phoenicians because they found coinage, but they've also noticed there's similarity between the names of certain places like Thanet and Phoenician ideas, etc. So either trade or that, because out of Britain came very little, but what came out of it was tin and copper, and that, of course, for the Bronze Age was incredibly important. We notice that there's glass, and the glass itself would come from Phoenicia, so how did Britain know how to make it? Then that also is the thought there might have been, and colonization, of course, is not taking over, it's just producing colonies, coming to live with people. That would show that happened. Also flax, and they brought flax, so they would enable the British people to be able to make linen. So a lot of things were coming in on trade. We know this from Strabo and also Sir John Evans, so if you'd like to know more about that, please have a look at it. But both people were soon colonized and enslaved by the Roman Empire. What the Roman Empire wanted to do was they wanted to take the people that they had colonized and produce the manpower, and then almost an industrial situation where they would put people in Britain into mines, slaves, soldiers, and also they would be on the boats themselves. And it was an interesting point when I met archaeologist Ali Atib recently, and he was helping me with his drone work of Iraq, that he's an archaeologist, a lead archaeologist in Iraq. And he was going to show me gave me the pictures for workshops I was going to do, or I've done. And he said that there were 200 boatmen from Mesopotamia that were taken to Britain at that time. And they opened, or they were the reason for the name of Arabia, which is in South Shields. What we know is that the Mesopotamian boatsmen were integrated into society, and they didn't go back. They stayed there. When I was at Bath, I was very, very excited to find out that there was a little pulley, a model pulley system in Bath, Roman baths, and it said that the Welsh masons had been trained by the Middle Eastern master masons who have been brought over as artisans, and we think they definitely were paid for that. And they were brought over, and they taught the Welsh masons, or they worked together to produce pulley systems and the new architecture that was being created by Rome. So we have all that intercultural interaction that is happening through the centuries. We also have rebellion. That's why there were so many forts. And as you can see, this is an artisan interpretation of Queen Boudica and also Queen Zenobia. Zenobia of Palmyra. So we have Boudica of the Iceni tribe in Britain, and that was 60 AD. And then we have Zenobia in Palmyra, and that would be on the Eastern Roman Empire in about 240 AD. And both women were rebel queens. They had compliant husbands who were Roman governors, and when their husbands died, we're not quite sure how they died, then these women raised their armies and they went up against Rome. Now, of course, in the end, they're going to really have a very gruesome ending, which has been watered down tremendously in the most recent history of it. When I was a child, we heard some quite gruesome ways of how they met their endings, but they have gone into legend, and their legend to defend their country and defend their people and to push forward an idea. That really inspired the women who were traveling, and often they traveled to see the place that it was, and also I'm going to show an example of this one. We see all of the arches, we see all of the stones. Now, I'm very excited about this too. This comes from the home of Lord Digby. It was painted by Lady Jane Digby al-Mezrab. And this was wonderful because I knew there was something like this, and I saw it in one of the bedrooms when he invited me to come and see everything that had been given. And it was in a bedroom, but in front of a bed, so I was on the top of the bed trying to photograph this, and I have his permission to show you today that this is Lady Jane Digby al-Mezrab's painting of Palmyra. And we talk quite a lot about her. Now, the Western Rome, that would collapse in 400 AD, and what we're left with is the Eastern Empire, and that now is called the Byzantine Empire. Apparently, I've learned that it was only named that after the end of the empire. And that was reduced gradually by the Islamic Empire as it was expanding. And it gets smaller and smaller, and that was the heralding of the golden age of Islam. And that inspired men and women of Europe to come and visit. We have traveling monastic scholars fluent in Arabic, such as Adelaide of Bath and Michael Scottus, that having learnt how to read Arabic because world knowledge was coming to the Golden Age, and that was the information was everything had to come in, it would be changed into Arabic, then they would then read it, and naturally, when they went back home, they changed it to Latin, and that really was one of the foundations for the European Renaissance. So that started to develop. Women went too, and they learned the culture, and they learned about herbs, medical practices, and clothes. And of course, the fashions changed, and they went home and took it with them. So you can see all the way through there is this thread of the influence of the Middle East for Britain and Europe. Within the empire, the European trade centres were built, and they were mainly Italian, not English. We had nothing to trade. A few skins, and tin was useful, but copper was sort of out of fashion. So what we had something called honorary consuls, and the honorary consuls continued up until the 20th century. That would mean if you had a British entity, it might not be run by British people. That would be an honorary consul, an honorary agent, and the honorary agent would then create the multicultural network. So the multicultural network might not touch Britain at all, but in the end, the trade would go into certain areas as such. So the honorary consuls took their cut, their percentage they were given, and they had a lot of trust given to them by Britain because they didn't know what they were doing at the time because they couldn't go out there because the boats themselves, until we had copper bottoms, etc., and the tall ships, they weren't good enough to travel. So we were dependent upon everybody else. Now, in 1453, and thank you so much to Hodeshower for telling me all about this, I listened very much to her research that she's doing it, and she explained to me, or gave me the hint, that Elizabeth I had a professional relationship with Sultan Murad III. And this happened in so it didn't happen then, but in 1453, the Ottoman Turks took the Byzantine capital coast. And what they did was they took also the capital itself called Constantinople, they changed it to Istanbul, which we know today. And they proclaimed the Sultan to be the new Caliph of his domain. He would eventually expand and he would come into Arabia, and that would be known as Ottoman Turkish Arabia. And I apologize if it wasn't known in certain areas, but that is what we know as it is today. If you can give me another name, then that would be wonderful. In 1553, Sultan the Great, Sultan Suleiman, he met Anthony Jenkinson. And Anthony Jenkinson was part of the Muscovy Company, and he came down through Persia into, and I've got to watch the time, I know, I do apologize for that. I'm watching it. Thank you. He came down into Aleppo, where people were being trained up, our people were there, training to be merchants. And he met him, and he got capitulations for trade. So that meant that hopefully the sailors would be taken into slavery, etc. So going through, and then we send our ambassador to Istanbul, and that is William Harben, and he will also create a consulate system. Now, the ambassador will create his consulate system out of what is now called a company called the Levant Company. And the Levant Company is incredibly interesting, so you can find out where the Levant is here. Have a look in these areas. And we look around the Mediterranean area and also Jerusalem, Aleppo, Damascus, all that region there. So the Levant Company is a chartered company, and it is very different, and I'm delighted to know about this, to the East India Company. They were both chartered, and they had king's or queen's charters, and they had different regions. So if you look at the difference between them, there was no charter for colonization for the Levant Company, nor did they want it. I couldn't have it anyway. They're in the Ottoman Empire. The East India Company we know about, everybody knows the history, but the Levant Company was their rivals. So they were regulated. They trained up their merchants, they trained them up in the language, the culture, and they insisted they would not become a joint stock and allow anybody to come in. Because of that, they were very unpopular in Parliament at the time, and they were dissolved in 1825. Now, we now go into the 1825 section with a certain lady called Lady Hester Stanhope. I've picked two ladies. They're totally different, and you will see why. She is the granddaughter of the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and that's the Earl of Chatham. She's the daughter of Lord Stanhope. He was a revolutionary and wanted to have a revolution in Britain. So they tried to get the girls away as quickly as possible. And she was hostess of the Prime Minister, Pitt the Younger. And that meant she looked after him within his house before he died in 1806. In 1810, she left England for good. She'd received a pension from the king, that's George III, for £1,200. That's a lot of money at that time. And she would have that for life. So she went away from Britain, and she was going on to Sicily. But she couldn't land there because there was going to be invasion by France. So she went on to Gibraltar, met Michael Bruce, who was her companion for 3 years. And it is his family's archive given to the Bodleian Library where we can access her letters. The letters between them, because they also had Lady Hester Stanhope's letters. And we're very grateful to him, to that family for that. In Athens, she met Lord Byron, who said of her, that dangerous person, a woman of wit. Now, this is Dr. Marin. He is her doctor, and he's also her biographer, and he wrote everything about her life. And this gentleman, if you'd like to know about the Ottoman world certainly the Ottoman, the world, because they traveled so far, and I'll show you where. Here, that's what they went through. If you want to know about the Ottoman Empire and what happened, he was going into every single area, and he's written that down. And I've just got to go back. I do apologize because he has the names here. The books he's written are Travels of Lady Hester Stanhope, volumes 1 to 3, and Travels with Lady Hester Stanhope as related to her physician, and forming the completion of her memoirs. And these are seminal works, and I please, so much is in there about history, because Lady Hester didn't live or didn't stay with Bruce or the doctor. Men were separated as they travelled, so she would stay in a convent or a private house, but they couldn't stay in the same house with her. So they got to see everything, and they've written about everything. What happened with the Ottoman Empire was that you have very many different cultures and stratification. So if you have Turkification, that meant that the Turkish people at the top, and depending upon your religion and your culture, you were in a certain structure. And Gertrude Bell in 1900s would write, society is divided by caste, sect, and tribe into infinite numbers of groups. Each one of them is following its own law. A man may go into public veiled up to the eyes or in a girdle. He will excite no remark. Why should he? Like everyone else, he's merely obeying his own law. so may too the European pass up and down with little interest. And it was in the style of the great Arab queens that Lady Hester went into the buildings and went into the areas, so much so that she caused her consul to have almost a heart attack. She would not veil, and she went through gates that Christian people couldn't go through, Franks couldn't go through, and she would just ride through, and nobody was brave enough to tell her not to, because during a shipwreck, she decided she would forever wear men's clothing. It was much easier, and she rode side saddle, as I found out, but she would look like a young bay with all her swords and everything. Therefore, they'd accept her, and they say, if you wear men's clothes, we'll accept you to be able to talk. She met the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. She visited the emir of Diriyah at the house of Saud, and she stayed there for 3 days. During his expansion of the territory towards Istanbul, he was taking over the whole area, and this is in Marianne's work and her letters. And she moved to a place called Mar Ilyas. And if you look at this, she went there after Bruce had left her, and she had the plague. So all her letters had to be dipped in vinegar. So it's great fun to try and read her letters in the Bodleian Library, because they've been dipped in vinegar and they're very hard to decipher. So there are lots of tricks to be able to read the cursive script. What she did was, in this way, she would pass her messages on to the consuls and the royal family, the Duke of York and the Duke of Wellington, and they would know about the dangers to do with the trade routes. So she would give all that information. We think, due to the cost of everything, that she received stipends from the companies. She received a pension from I'm watching it, sorry about that. Yes, I'm good, I'm one. She received a pension from the government, but she'd also received stipends, so she was able to do various things and look after people. She wasn't known to be a very friendly person. She was majestic, but she would suddenly give a lot of money to somebody who had no money because of the earthquake. She would take in the young men who were trying to be conscripted into the Ottoman army. And it was Mary Eliza Rogers who has written a marvelous book called The Domestic Life in Palestine, which I haven't included. And she was shown around by a gentleman who had one eye. And he said, would you like to know why I have one eye? And she said, oh, if you want to tell me. So he said that most of the mothers would blind the boys so they wouldn't have to be conscripted into the Ottoman army, because they didn't have clothes, they didn't have food. And this comes all the way through Lady Anne Blunt's work, travels through Nejd and everything, a pilgrimage through Nejd. And about the poverty that these soldiers had. And therefore, when they were taken over to another country, there was a problem for that. So she would take a lot of these boys in. Now, what she also does is, and I'm very grateful to the Royal Collection for being able to display this photograph view of the Temple of Jupiter in Baltek, is that she also had her journeys to all the ancient sites. And if she wanted to do anything at all, then she'd have to have somebody from the Ottoman government to come with her. And she totally accepted that. And she was told that there was some gold that was buried. And as she dug, and she took 100 men, it cost her £10,000 to go through. As she dug, they went through an old mosque, and they found an old mosque. They didn't go through it, they went round it. There's an old mosque on top of an old church, on top of an old temple. And in that old temple, she found this, and it's Colossus. It's a very, very large statue. They brought it up to the ground, and she was so frightened that the Sultan, who, of course, didn't agree with any statue whatsoever or idol, would not allow her to do everything, because she was with great respect for him, that she smashed it in little pieces. And she was in great trouble for that, because this could have been something that could have been put off to a museum. What happened beforehand was this was drawn, so we know exactly what it looked like. And this is what Marion put into his book. So we have an idea of what it was about. So I won't read her letter, right? In 1819, a famine caused the descent of 100 or more people on Mar Elias, and she fed them. And she supplied medication, and she determined that Mar Elias would be much, much too small. So she went up to Dune and to the Mount of Lebanon, which was really ruled by the Emir Bashir. And she built beautiful gardens, she built stables, outhouses, small rooms, etc. And this is what we can see, this is the plan. And this is the plan of her house that she built as such. She also put a wall more than 10 feet high surrounding the property. Now, what we know on her death is that she had a room full of saddles. So we think she was having a mini army or miniature army that would actually fight against what would happen in the future if needed. And it did. And in 1831, Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt invaded Syria. And he was supported by the emir. And the Maronites sided with Ibrahim Pasha, but the Druze did not. And therefore the Druze descended upon the house of Lady Hester. And she defended them. And she said, "You will not come into this house." So remembering, Britain was not doing anything, so they weren't taking sides. So they weren't saying, "Oh, she's representing Britain." So she stood up to this, and they decided they weren't going to touch her because she played mad. They said, "We don't want to touch a mad woman." She wasn't mad because very quickly after that, her pension was going to be stopped. The new queen had come onto the throne, and she said she shouldn't get the pension anymore. That was her money. So she wrote so many letters to the newspapers, and they were published. Could you imagine having an actual argument with the Queen of England through letters and newspapers? And they went as far as Australia, and they were discussing it. Everybody was discussing it. Sorry, apologies. So what would happen here is she decided that she would wall herself in protest, and she did. What happened there was that she was incredibly thin, very weak, and very frail because she wanted to make a stance. And it might have been a hunger strike as such, because we remember that today, don't we? And what happened there was she was supported by a lot of people. She was so angry because of the fact that she had not spent a penny of British money, and she'd spent it all on her own money, maybe investments, whatever, to build up a name of somebody from Britain within the Middle East, and that hurt her incredibly. And she was supported by a lot of people. What we know is that Kirsten Ellis, writer of the curious case of Lady Hester's remains, visited Lebanon in 2010, and she spoke to Father Suleiman Abbott, and he was in a nearby monastery about Lady Hester. Now, in 2004, the British Embassy had scattered her ashes on her home, finally. That it was moved, the bones were moved around in many places, and they had a ceremony. And Father Suleiman stated that he could not possibly do that to so great a lady because she had looked after his population. She'd built a fortress for his people and cared for so many people that as soon as the people went in the embassy, all the monks went and collected all the ashes up, and they gathered them up to rest by their saints and their bishops. So I thought that was a wonderful ending to a lady who had a very colourful life as such. Now, the second lady that I'm going to talk about is Lady Jane Digby al-Mazrab. And now, there was a wonderful speech by Dr. Ziad Rajab about Lady Jane. But I have noticed that many people stop at a certain point when they come to Middle East. So I started there, and that's what I mentioned to the Earl of Leicester and Lady Jane's, not a descendant, but family, that I wanted to talk about her work in the desert. And I'm going to start where Lady Jane came to Syria with express wish to visit the antiquities of Palmyra. And as you can notice here, this is this wonderful painting by Carl Hug. And this was sent to me as online by the Raja Museum. So I'm very grateful to the Raja Museum for being so supportive and letting me know so much. So I have these two pictures I can show you. She wanted to visit Palmyra, but the British Council would not allow her. He said it's far too dangerous, and she was very attractive. She was very beautiful, very small, and she didn't look like Lady Hester at all. Everybody who met them thought, oh heavens, they're totally different. And this is what she looked like without her traditional clothing on. And at the end, I've gone back, do apologize on that one. At the end of her trip, that was actually led by Sheikh Murad al-Mezrab, he asked her to marry him. And she said, I cannot marry you, you're married. And he immediately divorced his wife, which I think is quite unfair, really, don't you? But he divorced his wife, and he was 20 years younger than her, and he became her fourth husband. Now, a wonderful thing I've learned from the family is the husband she had beforehand, the three husbands she had beforehand, princes, lords, earls, etc., they all still paid money to her. They all still wanted her to be happy. So she was quite a happy person, I would say. This is a wonderful thing. This is the box that Sheikh Murad sent to Lord Digby on the death of Lady Jane. And what you see here is her design, and it was so wonderful for me that I could actually read them and look at them. And you see the design of her house in Damascus, and she actually wrote it on this letter, etc. Now, she was a marvelous bookkeeper. As you can see, this is her bookkeeping, and she would put down everything, every cost of everything. Therefore, she knew exactly what was happening. She would make sure she wouldn't have a debt in any way. But what you can see now on this side is the fact that there's a shopping list, and the shopping list goes to different places, and it tells us that she is going not only in Damascus, but she's also going to Baghdad in the desert, and she's getting all these things. So she can actually buy this here, take this, etc. And because she was married to the Sheikh, she spent 6 months in the desert. This is one of her paintings of Damascus, just to show you that it is, as you can see, you have the Black Mountains and you have a wall around the city. That is it. So this also was in her bedroom, and I managed to get there, which is fabulous. So what we're going to look at now is the fact that she was very concerned about the tribe. And they finally accepted her, and his brother accepted, the major sheikh accepted her. And they accepted her. She learned the actual Arabic, and she would hold her own divan. She would sort out squabbles. She would perform minor operations. She would also perform husbandry, and she would look after all the animals as such and be a veterinary surgeon. When she went to Britain, she had to learn everything and bring everything back. So she really put herself into the tribe. And this is what she actually said about the tribe. She stated that, I fear winter will not be pleasant, as there's a great expedition is mediated against the Shama Arabs. Several Aniza sheikhs have settled to drive them out to Mesopotamia. So whatever we read now, if we look at the actual letters, we realize it might not have been that. Maybe that doesn't happen. Somebody summarized it. She was allowed to speak at council, which I'm really surprised at, but then I'm not. So they respected her viewpoint, and also she spoke for Majdur as well. And she says that war in the desert with Omar Pasha, beaten again and again. They caught him in the marshes and pretended to fly before him, then cut the dikes of the Euphrates and deluged the country. And all his people were drowned. So we got hydraulic warfare at that time. And so this was a marvelous way of finding out, certainly in Tanzimat, where we wanted the modernization of Turkey and the Ottomans, and they were trying then to control the Arab tribes and tax them and decide what they were going to conscript them. And of course, lords of the desert are not going to be controlled by anybody, ever. So they were fighting up against this all the time. Another thing she says, which is about warfare and raids, and she was part of that too. And she says, this winter's been a regular war here. The women tuck the tents into a very large circle, and they make barricades of them, putting camels and horses within. And they arm themselves with stones, slings, and clubs. She said, I was so proud of our women. The defeated tribe flew towards the tents because the menfolk had got them out of a certain area, so they flew towards the women, hoping to take the horses that were still in the tents. And the women fought. And they won, but 400 people were killed, and they took the horses of the invading tribe as well. So she was part of all of this. She joined the battles, and she was fiercely protective of her own branded stock. And she would go to the Ottoman courts to fight back to get the stock back and be retrieved. Now, I'm still going very fast. She lived outside the wall, of course, and of Damascus. And you also had certain areas, as I've stated. And in 1860, there was a great massacre of the Franks. And this picture has been courtesy of the Royal Collection, and this is the Frank Quarter. So there was a big massacre, and the monasteries were razed, and the priests were killed, and the inhabitants murdered. And this is what she states, because she couldn't get out because she was on top of her house that they had built. Her husband, Sheikh Majdur, and the sheikhs of the area, they all, which I get very emotional about when I talk about it, they all blocked the major doors, and they lay across it so nobody could come into the houses that they knew of a lot of Frank families. The Muslim people kindly opened their doors and they took in the Franks, thousands of them, and they fed them against this Ottoman-led group that were determined to have a very large massacre that was going on. Thousands and thousands were killed, and she was watching it. So I won't go on to how she related what happened in the massacre, but there is a letter on it, which I read. So what she noticed was that France was coming in, Britain was coming in, the Ottomans did not want that to happen again. Therefore, they went in and stopped it, and everything was all right. Therefore, she was all right to go out and look after the people that had been damaged or murdered, not murdered, but their families, etc. And the people were given lots and lots of food because thousands were on the streets at the time. This is the tent of the Prince of Wales, Edward, Victoria's son. And this picture there shows that they did not live in the consulate house. They didn't live in anything beautiful. They bought their own tents if they were coming to travel. And the Prince of Wales is quite interesting because he wanted to find out about what was going on in the countries and also check up on anything England was doing that maybe he wasn't approving of. So this is one of the tents that they were given. Lady Anne Blunt came to visit her on her quest to buy Arabian horses. And also, we'd have a house that was given to the Blunts by Lady Jane, and she would look after them in all those different ways. In 1870, and that was 11 years before she died, she lost her British nationality. Whilst British men retained their subject status on marriage to what they called an alien wife or foreign wife, and the foreign wife could then be naturalized and become British. If a woman married somebody who was foreign, in 1870, they would lose their nationality. So at the end of her life, Lady Jane Digby al-Mazrab effectively was not British. It had been taken away from her. She couldn't take a protection from anybody, and Sheikh Majdur could not take a protection either. Although the consuls were very good to her, and they would try and get her letters to her mother into their bag, the diplomatic bag that went through. On 11th of August, she died in her house in Damascus. Sheikh Majdur laid a pink stone slab from Palmyra on her grave, and it's there today. And he brought her white mare to that funeral. Her great niece, interestingly enough, Lady Evelyn Coppard, visited the holy cities of Mecca and Medina because she had converted to Islam. So she was buried in Scotland with the first Islamic funeral for a European that had happened in Scotland. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to what I've told you today. There is so much more to tell you, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.